The irreversible moment. A story of downfall. This isn't the kind of story you'd want to hear before bed, but I can't stay silent, even if telling it will shatter my world completely. Today, I'll tell you about a crime I didn't just witness, but became entangled in myself. Wait, before you go any further, let me warn you. This isn't an ordinary story. You might think you know how it ends, but the truth will outdo your expectations. Every moment will keep you on edge. You have a choice: stay and uncover the reality, or stop now before it gets too late. But if you decide to stay, remember, after hearing this, you might never see the world the same way again. I knew something was off from the moment I got the first phone call. Yet back then, I had no idea just how deep the fall would be. This was my own descent, straight into the abyss. There comes a moment in everyone's life when everything you thought was stable and secure suddenly shatters. We all like to believe in the illusion of stability. We build our walls of trust, surround ourselves with familiar comforts, and convince ourselves that our world is under control, until one unexpected event destroys everything. For me, that moment came on a crisp autumn night. Nothing in particular hinted that something was about to go wrong, but there was a chill in the air, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel a little colder, a little more distant. I remember sitting at my desk, surrounded by papers, the hum of the city outside my window. I had a sense of peace, a routine that had lulled me into a false sense of normalcy. Little did I know that this would be the night that would turn my life upside down. The phone rang sharply, jolting me from my thoughts. It was a late-night call, the kind that always raises a red flag. In my line of work, you come to expect that nothing good ever comes after dark. My job, after all, was to dig into the shadows, to uncover things people wanted to stay buried. I've been a private investigator for 15 years, specializing in cases that most people would rather not touch. Cheating spouses, missing persons, the occasional fraud. I had seen it all, or so I thought. The voice on the other end was shaky, drenched in a kind of desperation I hadn't heard in a long time. His name was Tony, and though he tried to keep his composure, I could hear the cracks in his voice, like something fragile and delicate was breaking inside him. "My wife, she's gone," he said. I don't know what to do." Those words echoed in my head long after the call ended. A missing person case, I thought. Routine stuff. But there was something about his tone, the urgency and fear beneath the surface, that made me pause. It wasn't just a man reporting his wife missing. It was something more, something darker. I could feel it in my gut, that old detective's instinct kicking in. He didn't want to involve the police. That was the first sign that this was no ordinary case. Normally, if someone disappears, you call the cops. But Tony insisted on handling it privately. He didn't want the attention, as he put it. That set off alarm bells in my head, but curiosity got the better of me. It often does. And so, I agreed to meet him the next morning, not knowing that I was stepping into a nightmare that would unravel everything I thought I knew about human nature. The next day, I found myself standing in front of Tony's house, a grand, imposing mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was one of those places that screamed wealth and privilege, the kind of home where people like to keep their problems hidden behind high walls and expensive furniture. Tony met me at the gate, and the first thing that struck me was how much worse he looked in person. His voice over the phone had been frantic, but seeing him up close, the bloodshot eyes, the disheveled appearance, it was clear he hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he fumbled with a cigarette, the lighter slipping from his grasp. He was a mess, the kind of man on the edge of a breakdown. We went inside, and the house felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. I could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Tony led me to the living room, where he collapsed onto the couch, his hands shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the floor, as if the weight of everything was too much to bear. "Tell me what happened," I said gently, not wanting to push him too hard but knowing that time was of the essence. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but his voice cracked as he spoke. "It's been 3 days since Emma disappeared. She went out for a walk, just like she always does in the evening, but she never came back. I thought maybe she wanted to see a friend, or that she needed some time to herself, but..." His words trailed off, and he buried his face in his hands. I could see the guilt etched into every line of his face, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that gnawed at him from the inside out. "I've looked everywhere," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Her friends, her family. No one's seen her. And I can't go to the police." That was the second red flag. Why not go to the police? What was he afraid of? "Why can't you call them?" I asked, leaning forward. "If she's missing, they can help." Tony's eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer to me, his voice a whisper. "There are things you don't understand about us, about our marriage." And just like that, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple missing person case. There was more to this story, a lot more. As I started my investigation, I began with the basics. I spoke to Emma's friends, her colleagues, even some of her family members. They all said the same thing. Emma was kind, caring, someone who would never just up and leave without telling anyone. She and Tony had been married for nearly 10 years, and while their relationship wasn't perfect, whose is? No one could believe that she would simply vanish. But the more I dug, the more I started to see cracks in the picture Tony had painted. A few of Emma's friends mentioned that she had been distant lately, withdrawn, as if something was bothering her. One of them even hinted that Emma had been thinking about leaving Tony, though she hadn't shared the details. And then there was the argument. It came up in almost every conversation I had. A few weeks before she disappeared, Emma and Tony had a huge fight. Neighbors had heard yelling, things being thrown. But when I asked Tony about it, he brushed it off, saying it was nothing serious, just a typical marital spat. His demeanor, though, told a different story. There was something about the way he avoided eye contact, the way he fidgeted with his hands, that told me he wasn't being entirely truthful. The more I pressed, the more he retreated into himself, until finally, he snapped. "I didn't kill her," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I loved her. I could never." The outburst was raw, filled with a kind of anguish that sent a chill down my spine. But it also raised questions. Why would he leap to such a conclusion? No one had accused him of anything. Not yet. As the days passed, my unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that Tony was hiding something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together, and the more I tried to force them, the more elusive the truth became. Then, on the 5th day of the investigation, I received an anonymous note. It was slipped under the door of my office, written in shaky, hurried handwriting. The message was simple, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "Ask Tony about that night." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just those 5 words. It didn't take a detective to figure out that that night referred to the argument Tony and Emma had before she disappeared. But what exactly had happened? And why was someone so intent on keeping it a secret? I confronted Tony again, but this time he was even more agitated than before. He paced back and forth in the living room, his hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His once well-groomed appearance had deteriorated further. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, and there was a wildness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Who sent you that note?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But they want me to ask you about the fight. What happened that night, Tony?" He stopped pacing and stared at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, as if frozen in place, trapped by his own fear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I didn't mean to hurt her." The room seemed to grow colder as those words hung in the air between us. I felt my stomach drop, a sinking feeling of dread creeping up my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. Tony swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "It was an accident. We were arguing. Things got out of hand. I pushed her, but I didn't mean to. She fell, hit her head on the table. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Could this be it? Could Tony have killed his wife in a fit of rage, then spent the past few days covering it up? But something didn't add up. If Emma had died that night, where was her body? Why hadn't Tony called the police immediately? What happened after that? I pressed. "Where is Emma now?" Tony looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. She wasn't dead. She got up, walked out of the house. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She was so angry, and then she just disappeared. I don't know where she went." His words didn't make sense. If Emma had survived the fall, why hadn't she come back? Why hadn't anyone seen her? I left Tony's house that day with more questions than answers. Something still felt off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. All I knew was that Tony was hiding something, and it was bigger than a simple argument gone wrong. On the 7th day of the investigation, Emma's body was found. She had been buried in a shallow grave in the woods not far from their house. The discovery hit me like a ton of bricks. Despite all the signs pointing to something darker, I wasn't prepared for the reality of her death. But now, everything seemed to be falling into place. Tony's panic, his erratic behavior. It all made sense. He must have killed her, buried her in the woods, and then staged her disappearance to cover it up. That's what I thought, at least. But things still didn't feel right. The autopsy report came back a few days later, and with it came the shock of my life. Emma hadn't died from blunt force trauma, as I had suspected. She had been strangled. That single piece of information threw everything into chaos. If Emma had been strangled, then Tony couldn't have been the one to kill her in the heat of the moment. It had to have been premeditated. But why? And more importantly, by whom? My instincts told me there was more to this story. I revisited the case, combing through every detail I had missed. And that's when I remembered the note. The anonymous tip that had led me to confront Tony about that night. Someone had known the truth long before Emma's body had been found. Someone had been watching. I went back to Tony's house, determined to get the answers I needed. When I arrived, he looked even more broken than before. His hands shook as he opened the door, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I didn't kill her," he said before I could even speak. His voice was hollow, defeated. "I swear to God, I didn't kill her." "I believe you," I said, and for the first time, I meant it, but someone did. And I think you know who." Tony's face went pale. He stumbled back into the house, collapsing onto the couch as tears welled up in his eyes. "It was her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Her sister." The truth, as it turned out, was even more twisted than I had imagined. Emma's sister, Rachel, had always been jealous of Emma's life. The wealth, the marriage, the success. It had all eaten away at her for years. And when Emma had confided in Rachel about her problems with Tony, Rachel saw her opportunity. She convinced Emma to leave Tony, to meet her in secret. But when Emma tried to back out, Rachel snapped. She strangled Emma in a fit of rage, then buried her in the woods to cover it up. Tony had suspected Rachel all along, but he had been too afraid to say anything. He thought no one would believe him, and after everything that had happened, he had started to question his own sanity. That's why he had tried to cover up Emma's disappearance, not to protect himself, but to protect the only family he had left. But now, the truth was out. Rachel was arrested, and Tony was finally free from the burden of his guilt. But the scars of that night would remain with him forever. And as for me, I had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the people you think you can trust are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Thank you for listening to the end. If you noticed any details or have thoughts on this case, feel free to share them in the comments. Your perspective might reveal something I've missed.